Good morning, everyone. I'm Jan Tobias Mühlberg. I'm working at the KU Leuven as a researcher, and I'll be your chair for the talks for this morning for you. I'm really happy that we have like a really exciting set of speakers lined up today, starting with Chen from the International Computer Science Institute at Berkeley. Unfortunately, most speakers today will be remote, except for one. That's the situation we have right now with Corona. But otherwise, we have like a session set up that is focused on a theme that we named Getting Inspired by Technology Developments with Constraints. We have a series of speakers that come from a computer science background, from an economic background, from an AI background, even from an artistic background that share their knowledge with you. And I'm really excited for you to be able to participate in this joint exciting session around a common theme with so many different perspectives. So first speaker for today is Chen. I'm really happy to welcome him. He's working at the International Computer Science Institute at Berkeley. He has been developing ICT systems in various contexts for urban slums, rural areas. He's part of the organization team of the Limits workshop, and I'm looking forward to what he has to share with us. Good morning, Jay.
Hi,
the floor is yours.
Thanks for the intro. Thank you. Can you guys all hear me just fine?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me share my slides as well. Everything working?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So thanks for having me. I just spoke a little bit with Nicholas just now and asked him to give me a quick summary of what you all have been talking about the last couple of sessions. So my understanding is that quite a few speakers have come in and I've talked to you all about various aspects of sustainability. And so, you know, some of this might be review, but I'll try to keep that part as short as possible. So, you know, thanks again for inviting me to speak at your workshop. My name is Jay Chen. I'm a senior researcher at ICSI, and I'm a computer scientist by training. So I am not an expert in sustainability or climate change. I think very few of us, unless you've been doing, you know, climate research for a while, very few of us are actually experts in sustainability or climate change. We're all kind of from outside the field and coming to create this field. My background, again, is in computer science, but I've had a relatively unconventional career path that led me first to international development, and then to human-computer interaction, and then more recently to sustainability. And as mentioned in my sort of intro, I'm part of this loosely organized multidisciplinary group of folks who have been thinking for a while about the role that computing could and should play in the face of fundamental resource and planetary limits. So today, my goal is to present some of the ideas that we've come across from our engagement with these various sustainability issues, along with some of my own perspectives accumulated, you know, over the years about technology and society more broadly. I'm going to try to keep it under 30 minutes, actually. The shorter, the better. So that you know, we can have time to ask some questions. So I might speak a little bit fast, but yeah. So what's been kind of interesting as a bit of context is that recently I've been invited to speak at several you know, computer science or ICT related workshops, all trying to figure out what to do about technology and sustainability. I'm not a famous person, so I don't really get invited to speak at a whole bunch of things all the time, but this year there's been a dramatic uptick, maybe due to you know, COVID and all the various environmental disasters that are going on. So that's kind of interesting. And you know, I've heard a lot about you know, talks like mine that you're hearing today and talks like the ones that you've already heard from various folks and various perspectives. And you know, there are talks about machine learning and you know, technology and rebound effects, probably a lot of along the lines of what you've all been hearing about and thinking about. And so these are all important ideas, and I just want to try to put a wrapper around all of the things. So in any case, after each of the workshops, I'm pretty sure that most people would, you know, kind of go back to working on whatever it is they work on, whether it's you know, AI or data center research, whatever it is, you know, people are experts in, because that's what they're good at, that's what they're trained for, and that's what they get paid to do. And I've seen this play out, in my own community and in other communities as well. So it's not really that surprising because it's difficult after all to get someone to understand things that their salary depends on not understanding it. And so business as usual in a lot of situations is dependent on us not understanding or pretending to not understand really what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And so the idea of sustainability and its implications are difficult to psychologically accept is the conclusion that I've come to. Because they call into question, our sometimes unconscious, but in any case, deeply held beliefs about technology, society, and the future, even beyond the job-related incentives that are there. So today, I want to discuss some of these psychological and intellectual reasons why it's so hard to grapple with the real sort of deeper issues of sustainability. And I've been speaking about they and them at these other workshops, and as if everybody here in your workshop is somehow going to be exempt from these common psychological thought patterns. But I'm sure that many folks in the audience who are technologists or working in tech, or whatever descriptor you prefer, are also stuck in business as usual for various reasons, and maybe you're not even fully conscious of it. So before I begin my talk, I usually give this trigger warning that if at any point during my talk you're feeling denial, anger, bargaining, or depression, that's perfectly normal. I want you to kind of take the time to acknowledge that you're feeling something and try to figure out why you're feeling that and what you're feeling and why you're feeling that. Change is hard, and but we're all in it together. So hopefully my presentation will add some interesting perspectives, at least to help us think about how to think about and talk about sustainable ICTs. So I'll start really briefly by sharing my own story about how I got here. So about 15 years ago, 5 billion people in the world didn't have access to the internet. And because of the internet's obvious potential to solve a multitude of problems, universal access seemed like both an important problem to solve and one where I could actually make an impact. So I began, as any networking researcher would, by studying why some places didn't have internet and by collecting data from underconnected networks. And it seemed like an economics issue or a performance issue, so I designed various protocols and network optimizations and various systems to help bridge those gaps. And it took a while to get things to work, but when I did get things working, I found some usability issues, so I spent a few more years learning about HCI and resolving those issues. And then after that, it became a deployment issue, and then there were some maintenance issues, and then there were scale-out problems, and so on and so forth. And I went through many years of trials and tribulations. I learned a lot. I published a lot of papers, hopping from discipline to discipline. And all in all, I spent over a decade working with various schools, hospitals, and other stakeholders deploying protocols and services in over a dozen developing countries. And today, the good news is 2 billion more people are connected than more than they were back then. And I can personally only have claimed to have contributed about 10,000 people to that 2 billion statistic, which is depressingly tiny. But that's fine. I don't need to be the hero as long as we seem to have made some progress. But then if you look at this scenario again today, there are still 3 billion people not connected to the internet. And so the argument is exactly the same as when I started. And it seems like someone should really solve this problem. And maybe it's going to be Elon Musk, with Starlink or something, but, or maybe not. In any case, what I've come to understand over the years is that despite, optimism and optimistic rhetoric, it's unclear for many reasons, actually, whether the digital divide will ever be bridged. For example, at the macro level, there are consistently dramatically more resources devoted to the bleeding edge of tech innovation, which means that as technology evolves, it constantly leaves behind a long tail of users. And solving the technical problem really isn't enough by itself. And there are many, many other dynamics involved, like the ones I mentioned. So these could be categorized as social, cultural, economic, or political problems. So, everybody here presumably knows what climate change is, or what the sustainability issues are related to climate. But even if you know some facts, framing is extremely important. So, climate change and sustainability are framed as, these degrees C. And so what do these degrees C mean? So just to get us on the same page, if you look at the IPCC reports, roughly speaking, the degrees are the degrees of warming by the end of the century. And so 1 degree, you get these kinds of features like, ice-free Arctic summers, polar ecosystem damage, and so on and so forth. And these are things that we're already starting to see or about to see. At 2 degrees, we see lots of, bigger problems, more problems like species extinction, permafrost melt, and so on. At 3 degrees C, huge rainforest loss and much worse things. And then things start getting hazier and hazier as you go further on. And we're basically told by the IPCC that we shouldn't be exceeding this red line. So at most 2 degrees. And this has generally been optimistically framed by the IPCC and others as a problem that we still have time to reverse course on if we just manage to reduce emissions dramatically. However, the IPCC has been criticized for not taking into account tipping points and feedback loops and so on that could make it nearly impossible to reverse some of these trends. And so the latest IPCC report is very long. I've only read summaries of summaries, but my understanding is that those feedback loops are not now taken more into account, and therefore the warnings are even more dire than they were before. But generally speaking, the perspective is that we really shouldn't exceed 1.5 degrees. And we're already at 1.1 or so on today. So unfortunately, several well-cited studies indicate that there is now little to no chance of maintaining below 2 degrees. This isn't really about optimism or pessimism. This is just the data and analysis. So despite repeated high-level statements to the contrary, we can just look at what countries have committed to and what they're looking to do in the future. And we can see that we're on this path, even with the pledges that various countries are making, that we're going to hit this above 2 degrees gray line here. And so this is pretty scary, and it's way scarier than the popular hopeful narratives. And so this is a psychologically challenging thing to deal with. So the Limits to Growth book actually provides us a useful mental guide of what happens to a society in which you have resource crisis. So that is to say, you run out of resources, or you give up your fossil fuels, or you have some limits on the energy use of society. When that happens, you end up with a very rapid decrease in industrial output and food production and so on. And so we're probably not going to allow that to happen. So what happens when you say, well, we're going to continue to use resources by any means necessary, which means more mining, more drilling, and more renewables. So if that happens, then we end up in the scenario 2, where we use more resources, but we have a pollution crisis, and this is kind of where we seem to be headed. And we have this crisis because we didn't give up the fossil fuels and we didn't ramp up and transition to renewables fast enough. So the problem gets delayed a few years, but the crash actually comes way harder. And so thinking about these mental models of how we might have to deal with, on the one hand, a pollution crisis, and on the other hand, a resource crisis, the situation is pretty daunting. And although we have more data and more accurate models today than when Limits to Growth was originally written, nearly about 40 years ago, there's nothing substantially new about sustainability that we haven't more or less known for decades. And so, as Jimmy Carter, the U.S. president, said in 1974, we are grossly wasting our energy resources and other precious raw materials as though their supply was infinite. We must even face the prospect of changing our basic ways of living. This change will either be made on our own initiative in a planned and rational way, or forced on us with chaos and suffering by the inexorable laws of nature. And so, our projections are more accurate than ever, but we've known for a long time that this is coming. And one reason we haven't paid attention to it is because there's also an insidious politics of delay at work. Exxon has been actively suppressing climate impacts of pollution for longer than I've been alive. But even despite that, we've had plenty of time to realize what's going on. And so the question is, why is there so much interest in climate change today? Is it because scientists have finally gotten through to us, or is it because we finally have enough data to convince politicians, or is it because now we have the technology to make a difference, or is it because we're starting to feel some of the heat, right? Is it because we're starting to feel some of the effects? I think it's really that. And so anyway, in terms of the choices that we have today on how to deal with this problem, they're the same choices, I should point out, that we've always had, right? They're the same. And these are 3 choices. We can try to do option one, which is to be more efficient. So there are many people working on that, and more people now. We're getting efficiency gains in the couple of % a year range, which is meaningful, but not big enough. And it doesn't account for rebound effects that can diminish these impacts of efficiency gains without significant policy assistance. And then the second option is we can change sources or find more energy from elsewhere or cleaner energy. And there's a lot of scientists, again, trying to find new sources, but barring the miracle of a new highly efficient energy source that we can scale out in time, the natural thing that societies are trying to do is to substitute fossil fuels with cleaner renewables, but based on the most optimistic manufacturing capacity numbers coming directly from the various different renewables industries, we're installing at about 50% slower than we need to meet the 2-degree target. So I want to pause here for a second and point out that so far, these are just facts and figures, data and projections. There isn't really a whole lot to debate here. I'm just laying out the land. And so while some of this information might be surprising and the severity of the conclusions may be disconcerting, leading you or us to quibble about some of the premises or the conclusions or the exact numbers, the overall preponderance of evidence is pointing in this direction, and it's really quite staggering. And after if you read the literature, after reading the literature, the amount of evidence might still not be enough to convince certain people to raise objections and interrogate the status quo. So there is that. And so finally, there's this last option of changing our behaviors and using less. And so scientists and technologists seem to have a lot less to say about this option. Some people outright deny that it's possible, economists mostly, and believe that degrowth is a bad word because they think it means that our quality of life will go down, right? Our whole economy is based on a growth paradigm. Our whole culture is based on a consumption culture. All of our biggest companies are run by advertising, which is a driver of consumption. And so we don't really consider this one at all. However, to fix our broken global economy, which has been dependent on ruinous growth, scholars and activists of various stripes have proposed for quite a while now a post-growth economy or a degrowth economy of socially sustainable and equitable reduction of resource use coupled with changes in distributive practice. And so these ideas, if you haven't encountered them before, I would encourage you to do some reading, and I'll have references for you all at the end. But these ideas are as much about reimagining how we relate to each other and the world as they are about just production and consumption. And so post-growth philosophy, very broadly speaking, suggests that we can do better than the alienations of neoliberal atomism and the hyper-competitive struggle in which someone or something is always losing. But we seem to be, again, generally reluctant to consider degrowth as an option. And so, why is that? Well, I think it's kind of a cultural problem as much as it's a psychological or intellectual one. Our entire Western notion of progress has historically been tied to production, consumption, and growth. And so our entire modern society is predicated on economic growth forever and for whatever the consequences. And since technological change has been the most important factor in recent memory that determines the rate of economic growth, it's not surprising that we've become techno-deterministic and techno-utopian. We imagine that with every new discovery or new invention, we're making some inevitable progress forward towards a better and brighter future. And even when once in a while something doesn't work out, we imagine, promise that we'll fix it because, of course, we can. We tell ourselves that the next thing will be better because it always is. That's fairly delusional, and that's denial. And so it is with climate change. We ignore the evidence and stay the course. We keep on believing that if we just pool our collective IQ and creativity together, we'll manage to squeeze out another technological fix for something that it can't be fixed through technology. These are societal problems, and they won't really just go away. This essentially magical thinking is pervasive in the tech industry, which is kind of ironic because as technologists, we really should know better, at least better than the average person. Instead, like a drug addict or a degenerate gambler, we really don't want to fundamentally change ourselves or our society, and instead we bend over backwards to find justification why we must build the next new thing and why that's actually a good idea. carbon dioxide extractors will decrease warming, desalination plants will renew our water systems, vertical farms or something, or precision agriculture will solve our food problems. These are all promises that we've heard before. I'm not saying that these technologies will fail, but at some point it's reasonable to check ourselves and our unbridled enthusiasm and consider some of the alternatives as well as some of the unforeseen consequences. And so, if you imagine that there's, say, like a 5% chance that we won't come up with a technology fix or something, wouldn't it be rational to spend 5% of our time, resources, or energy on alternative ideas as a hedge against our own misled optimism? So our manifest destiny in this techno-utopian sense can be summarized by this William Gibson quote: "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet." People really love this quote because it evokes the immediacy of the future within the present. It suggests that the most highly advanced aspects of society today give us a glimpse into the future and that we'll all eventually progress to that future. But what does that future look like? If you Google for the future, most images look something like this: more high tech, more stuff, more everything, and faster. But is it really what we need? Is more leading us to better and more fulfilled lives? Is us everyone? What are the hidden costs? If we don't stay within 2 degrees, just one of the results will be dramatic increases in extreme weather events, which we are already seeing today. And so the future may look more like this. This is a photo from last year's Southern California fires. I'm sure there are many more photos from this year's California fires, which are, again, record-breaking. Or this photo from, this year's winter power outages in Texas. And there are many, many photos like this. Hurricane Ida and so on are happening right now as we speak. So, William Gibson is right, but not in the direction that futurists imagine. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. And and our interpretation of this quote is like a Rorschach test for our own socioeconomic condition. In a 2019 Pew survey, it found that the majority of American adults expected income inequality to worsen over the next 3 decades, the economy to be weaker, the environment to be worse, and healthcare to be more expensive. And 2/3 predicted that domestic political divisions would become more pronounced. And this existential dread seems to have permeated our collective unconscious as well. So just for fun, here's a screenshot of post-apocalyptic films released each decade from Wikipedia. And I would posit that this geometric increase says something about our growing anxieties. So last I checked, the number of films released each year in the US is increasing roughly linearly by comparison. So we've envisioned a lot of cataclysmic futures for ourselves. And in fact, the view that global crisis will occur in the future reflects a parochial developed world perspective. For 2/3 of the world's population, crisis of scarce resources, inadequate housing, deplorable conditions of health, and starvation are already at hand. This was written nearly 40 years ago. And so we come right back to the beginning of my talk, which is where I came from, international development. And so when these crises directly affect us, climate change feels much more personal, immediate, and important. And the reality is climate change is already personal, immediate, and important to many millions of people around the world. Contrary to first world sci-fi fetishizations, collapse is probably not going to be a single mega disaster with zombies or something, but instead it's going to be a series, or it is a series of failures at different scales that can cause ripple effects to other communities at often too slow to appreciate timescales. And as we run out of cheap natural resources and as climate change intensifies, economic pressures and environmental shocks at various scales will affect vulnerable populations. And these shocks will produce diminished socioeconomic well-being and destroy physical and social infrastructures. And when these inevitable crises occur, the affected communities will suffer and people will die, survive, or migrate. And our current and future global efforts to maintain growth results in increasingly extreme pressures. Our world will see increasingly frequent collapses. So who's going to suffer the most? As usual, it's going to be those who are already the worst off because they are the most vulnerable to shocks. Because as these stresses aggregate and overwhelm a community, they'll spill over potentially again and again and again until new equilibria are reached at lower standards of living. We can see this from basically the divide that's happened with the COVID pandemic. The wealth gap is increasing and the people suffering are at the bottom. So this future isn't just here, it's already happening. It's already happened during the Syrian conflict, during COVID, and various other scenarios like this. We're seeing mass migrations from Central America to the US because their crops are failing. But you might think to yourself, well, wait, that's not us, we'll be fine, right? You're a perennial optimist, And there's a debate to be had about optimism versus pessimism. Well, this is us, right? This is us today in Los Angeles and in many other cities around the world. Homelessness is getting worse, and politicians are under fire about this, but they're really somewhat powerless against the massive forces at play. And again, the problem is fractal. So when the time comes, we can't just build a wall to keep them out because they are also us. Now, I'm not here to guilt trip people into quitting their job and living in a cave. All I'm saying is that as highly insulated members of society, we should try to do what we can in exchange for our privilege. And the only way that this works is that we all do our part, and we don't just rely on Mr. Elon Musk to terraform Mars or give us all robots. So sometimes confronting these huge issues seems a bit overwhelming, but we have more power than we think. And so the silver lining, the one bit of optimism in my talk is that since the problem is fractal, so are the solutions. We can actually make an impact at all scales, and even small change matters with a capital M. So far I've made the case for considering degrowth as an option, for reconsidering techno-utopianism, and for reimagining ourselves as active global citizens rather than mere consumers. So what's stopping us? Well, there are all these high-level conceptual ideas that don't translate particularly well into action, especially in the context of many of our technological professional lives. And there are actually a lot of structural incentives that keep us in place, such as salaries, funding, publishing, tenure, and so on and so forth, that I'm sure that many of us are well aware of, but generally conform to anyway and may feel powerless against. Because of these incentives and structures, academics in the crowd, we write papers, basically about the same topics, generally doing what Thomas Kuhn called normal science rather than revolutionary science. And other than these structural issues, which we can chat more about during the Q&A, there are actually many intellectual barriers as well that are less obvious that we use to provide cover for the underlying incentivization structure. And so I'll talk about just 3 of these barriers now. You might be familiar with some of these. But as an engineer by training, I didn't encounter these until way after grad school, which is far too late. So the first barrier is this techno-deterministic thinking, which I've already touched on. Leo Marx wrote about this in 1997. In summary, Marx found that conceptualizations of technology as an autonomous agent disrupt our ability to see technology and its design as something that we might be shaped by humans and our political and ethical concerns. We've effectively surrendered our own agency with this kind of thinking. And furthermore, because technology has become an end in and of itself, we fail to consider whether the ends actually have been accomplished. Instead, we concentrate on technical sophistication or novelty, right? You see this in paper reviews all the time, right? Nobody cares what the thing is for. People care whether it's cool, from a technical standpoint, whether it's technically novel, whether it's interesting. So taking the food system as an example, since food is one of the essential things for humanity, I'm sure that you've all heard of precision agriculture and so on. And computer science is going to help all that stuff happen. And unfortunately, these are going to be new means, but unfortunately for the same ends. And so, this is just one example. So what is the state of our food system? Well, I don't have too much time to get into this, but basically there's this uneconomicness of growth that's happening. So in 1940, the food system produced 2.3 calories of food energy for every calorie of fossil fuel energy it used. And now it takes 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce a single calorie of modern supermarket food. And this is basically processed junk food, which is filled with sugars and various other nasty things that aren't good for your health anyway. And so we've become what seems to be more efficient, but actually very, very inefficient in sort of other dimensions. And we're wasting more energy than ever just to get less healthy. So I'm not an expert, but I'm skeptical that just adding precision agriculture to be more efficient is going to solve problems like this. But you might think, wait, that's just a policy problem. It's not a technology problem. Of course, precision agriculture is good. So this brings me to a second mental barrier. So this is dualism. So we're stuck in this dualistic thinking that goes back to Descartes or Plato. Dualism permeates Western thinking in general. Arturo Escobar has a great summary in his book, Designs for the Pluriverse. He calls them the 3 fundamental dualisms of Euromodernity. And basically, this is the divide between nature and culture, between us and them, the West and the rest, and between subject and object. And in tech, we tend to divide problems into technical and non-technical, right? Technical and societal, technical and everything else. And this causes us to be unable to see important relationships with societal issues in the bigger picture. And this separation conveniently absolves ourselves from the responsibility of engaging with important issues and the consequences of our actions. Similar divisions also exist between theory and practice, research and activism, and so on and so forth. I don't know how it is in each of your respective fields, but in many areas of systems research, relevance and impact have become synonymous for, profitable for tech companies, which is quite sad. And so before dismissing this as some kind of hippie thing, I'm not suggesting that everything is the same or connected, but simply a recognition that things are not black and white or as clearly divided as we would like to believe. And things are kind of connected, but in interesting ways. And so reality looks something closer to this. There are generally distinct categories, but the boundaries are fuzzy and they definitely overlap. And these circles are getting more and more overlapping with each passing year. And so this is why we need to really think about sustainability in ICTs. And finally, the third barrier, I'm not going to really get into this too much, but there's this notion of wicked problems that Riddle and Weber introduced in the 70s to describe planning and policy making problems that can't be solved formally or through strictly rational means. Wicked problems are described as having certain properties that make them especially difficult or impossible to solve because they often entail incomplete or even contradictory knowledge. And this really just tangles up basically anyone trained in the STEM fields. Wicked problems are especially challenging for computer scientists because we're trained to formulate and solve problems of exactly, nearly the opposite nature. This is a famous quote by Butler Lamson. All problems in computer science can be solved by another level of interaction. So, our basic tenets lead us in computer science to render problems tractable through abstraction or divide and conquer. This abstraction is actually removing a lot of the complexity in order to focus on a specific aspect of the problem. And in computer science, while we learn abstraction, we don't really learn what it is we're removing. And I think that's really a shortcoming in CS education. So the consequences that we are insulated from look something like this. This is a picture from Agbogboshi, Ghana, which, if you don't know, is the world's largest e-waste dump, where the materiality of high tech ends up. And if you haven't been there, visiting Agbogboshi is like being inside of a movie. You're on a different planet, a wasteland. Everything is gray, and the smell of burnt trash assaults your nose while the acrid toxic smoke stings your eyes. Confronting these issues can really change your perspective on the glamour of technology. So anyway, I've spoken a lot about the hazards. What actually looks different if we look at the world through these alternative perspectives and understandings of technology and society? Sustainability, development, and crisis then are in fact deeply interrelated. They're interrelated problems or facets of the same problem rather than three separate fields that don't talk to each other. And we can understand sustainability as an attempt to prevent future collapse, development as an effort to reinforce against collapse, and crisis response as a reaction to collapse. These entangled issues also call to question what it is we're trying to sustain and for whom. How should we allocate our resources across these facets of climate change to produce the most benefit for the most number of people across, the most time? And whether we're privileging the resolution of climate change for ourselves in the future or ourselves in the present over the suffering of others today. So through this broadened worldview, we can actually observe that many important sustainability-related themes aren't being worked on enough. This is just a random list of values that are somewhat related to degrowth or sustainability. A lot of these are important and are, I want to point out that our value judgments are anchored by the structural incentives already in place, but they don't have to be. And we just don't work on these. And so making the argument in a completely different way, as an engineer, in many graduate level networking courses, there's a classic paper on the design philosophy of the internet. And David Clark wrote this piece, and he basically looked at all the different design goals of the original internet, and they were listed as follows, these general priorities. And the point of this paper is actually that the way that the internet was designed was not neutral, right? It was value-based. There were certain goals that were desired more than others, and that's how we came up with this particular design. And so, similarly, we can take a look at this list of values, and we can basically pick any of them that isn't being looked at enough and integrate them or try to design technologies that incorporate these kinds of values. And we can come up with totally different designs that are very interesting and can change the way our society works. And so I just wanted to leave you with that as a explicit idea of how to move forward. And this is a list of references for you all if you want to take out your phones and take a screenshot. And that's all for me today. So I'm happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Chen. There was a really exciting talk. In particular, I think it was a very different perspective from what we've heard yesterday, for example, where we had speakers who were talking about technology and presenting, for example, 5G development as a way forward to connect the global south. But what we saw on your slide in the beginning was basically that the global south is disconnected and will probably stay disconnected just because there's no investment there. What I'm interested in is, you've been posing this question at the very beginning of what we as researchers could do, but I think you didn't actually answer it, right? So what could be the perspective for us as ICT researchers in our current framework, which is dominated by funding sources that ask for innovation that is industrially marketable? What could be the perspective for us?
Yeah, so I think that the 5G part, I know that wasn't your main question, but just to point out that it's not really just a matter of funding. You know, 5G can be developed, and the point is that it won't be uniformly distributed anyway, and so there's going to be constantly some group of people that don't have access, can't afford access, or left behind for various other reasons other than technology, like literacy or numeracy. With regards to what we as academics can do, I think, you know, holding things like this workshop, I think one of the biggest things that educators, you know, produce is other than papers, is students. And so, you know, educating is basically one of the major things that we can do. I think workshops like this can help. The specifics on, you know, what kind of research you should do, I think there's, again, plenty of people already working on the status quo. I think I did kind of answer it in that way, in that there is status quo research, right? Normal science, you know, that's what everybody is doing. And then there's science that looks at these potentially other values that aren't being looked at, right? I mean, as a researcher, as an academic, let's say, you know, I'm a computer scientist, I work in distributed systems. There's plenty of, you know, things wrong with Facebook, right? Everybody talks about it. Nobody does anything about it, right? There's plenty of things wrong with, you know, technology mega corporations that don't, you know, respect our privacy, respect our, you know, right to be left alone, respect, you know, anything humanistic, right? Every single tech company relies on, you know, capitalizing on as much of our attention as they can, and then you know, siphoning off value from, you know, our activities. And so you can imagine basically a very simple thought experiment where, you know, what would a Google look like if there wasn't a central entity that was extracting value, right? That's a technical problem. Right, as soon as you set the, you know, goals in that way, it becomes a technical problem. Right, and so there are technologies. There's a bunch of research, you know, that happened, you know, 15 plus years ago in distributed systems that did look at these technical problems, but for some reason now they're out of favor, and that reason is because there's been, you know, basically corporate takeover through funding. But you know, you can do that kind of research as an academic. You have the freedom. You might not get quite as much funding, but I would argue that, you know, at some point, you know, you have to, you know, do the less optimal thing and really, you know, live up to your own values. Otherwise, you don't have those values.
That's a good answer. I think, are there questions from the audience? And I think we also have a question from the chat.
We will start with the audience. So maybe can you just raise your hand so that we know how many questions we have, because we have less than 10 minutes left. So one is here.
Thank you. Hi, Jay. Thank you for your talk. My name is Lou Grimal. I'm a PhD student. It was really interesting, and seeing sustainability not as a trendy thing, but as a real problem is great. Thank you. You talked about the revolutionary science, and you gave some characteristics on that. Do you actually, in your daily work, practice this revolutionary science yourself, and what are the difficulties you're facing practicing it?
Yeah, so I do. I think the difficulties are pretty obvious if you try it, right? Your papers will start getting rejected, as an example, right? Your grant proposals will start getting rejected, as an example, right? I've been writing grants about sustainability related ideas for, you know, six plus years, right? And then papers about them into conventional venues. Sorry, I want to stop sharing. Papers about them that are submitted to conventional venues basically will get waved away as being irrelevant, right? Because For example, if you design a alternative internet's infrastructure, right? People will say, oh, well, I mean, who's going to deploy that anyway, right? Or this isn't interesting for Google, right? I mean, there's plenty of these kinds of deflections that I have already kind of touched on in my talk. I didn't have time to get into details, but that's what happens, right? And so this is where, things are changing, right? The fact that there are all these workshops and all this interest in sustainability is happening. And so I would suggest that, you should try to be clever in having some interesting idea that's not the status quo, but you can kind of frame it in the status quo so that you can get through those kinds of hurdles as a strategy, right? And so as an example, I've worked on various projects that try to break the existing mold of efficiencies by looking at, for example, right now I have a project where we're trying to design take this list that was on the slides, looking at pluralism and how to design a pluralistic way of doing internet content moderation, which very few people are still working on. There was some interest a while ago, but it's certainly not mainstream.
Okay, thank you. We have like time for one question left, I think, or two questions.
We have 2 minutes left.
Okay, 2 minutes. Next question. Otherwise, we can also read the one from the chat.
There is no in the chat, I think. And
okay.
You can, if nobody has one, you can ask a second.
Thank you. I was wondering at the very start of your talk, or at the middle, I don't remember, you talked about the philosophy of post-growth. And at the end of your answer, you talked about pluralism. And I'm thinking, for example, I'm an Occidental person, 25 years old, woman, working on ICT. It's really hard for me to have this pluralism because my epistemology and ontology is defined by myself in the way I lived in. So I'm really concerned about how people from our countries are able to think differently and to design, let's say, transitional systems in ICT. So I was wondering, shouldn't we ask other, maybe non-researchers, but people from other ontology to design and to collaborate with them on that? So yeah, I would like to hear your opinion.
I think that's almost a question of practice, right? I mean, working with communities and community participation and so on. I mean, those are all sort of standards in human-computer interaction. And so I don't know what exactly your background is, but by mentioning pluralism, I didn't mean to say that, oh, you should do pluralism on your own, but that you should work with the communities that you're actually intending to, impact. So I design things, that I would want to use and that other people would want to use, that I know, right? I mean, I'm always user number one.
Does that answer your question to some extent? Okay. Thanks a lot, Chen. I have one last question to you. That is, since we are all looking for venues to publish on sustainability, when is the next deadline for limits?
Limits just passed, so the next deadline for that won't be for a while, but ICT for S is coming up soon. So I think that's in a couple months is the deadline.
Okay. So just some hints for you who look for venues to publish things.
Yeah, I think Compass is also coming up. So.
Yeah, for ICT for us, it's January, I think, the deadline. Fine, all good. We'll share it on our website anyway.
Thanks a lot, Chen.
Yeah, thanks. And if you would like to join a reading group, actually, on degrowth, please send me an email. I'm actually starting a reading group because I think a lot of people would benefit from that.
That would be really interesting, yes. Or maybe you could share some information and we put it on our internal channel for the workshop?
Sure.
That would be cool, yes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.